Well, today I think I will not talk about any particular news story, but rather something that I've been thinking about, which I'm certainly not the only person to think about, but I haven't really taken the time to really lay out my thoughts on the matter, and that is what happens after the election. Because we are getting close now. We are in mid-September, so we've got, a month and a half. November 3rd is coming up quick, and something that I've said before, that many people have said, and I think that is pretty much universally accepted at this point, at least by people who follow politics, is that we will have no answers on election night. Because of all of the mail-in ballots that are going to be coming in, all the people who, don't want to go out to a polling place because they're afraid of getting sick, and two, people who have been encouraged to vote by mail, and then also all the people who received, vote by mail ballots automatically in certain localities and certain jurisdictions or electorates, whatever you want to call it. People who received those ballots and then decided, well, because I have a mail-in ballot, I'm just going to fill it out and mail it back in. In most places, these ballots cannot be opened until the election is over. That's when they start counting the ballots. And so because we're going to have such a substantial portion of all these ballots, we will not have a result on election night. And this is very troubling because I was actually, there's a good article in the American Prospect on this. It was, I saw an interview this morning with the author of it, and I looked at the article afterwards, and he made a good point about how the length of time between when an election is held and when you get the final results plays a lot in the legitimacy of that election in the eyes of the public. The longer that you go between when the votes are cast, and when the results are announced, that will delegitimize the results in the eyes of much of the electorate, because what they wonder when all of that is going on is they think about what sort of monkey business is afoot. What are they doing that's taking so long to count all those votes? And it's just people's minds wander and things, and a lot of those concerns are quite legitimate. And so let's say that we have a pretty normal election. There's no close races in any swing states or anything like that. We don't know the result on election night, and then it just turns out that it takes a couple weeks to count all the mail-in ballots, and then we get a final decision. Under that scenario, the election is still going to be viewed as less legitimate than it otherwise would have been if we got all of those results and all the votes counted on election night. Especially after what happened here in Florida back in 2018, when you had the supervisor of elections for Broward County, who ended up being removed from office because she was she was messing with the votes. She had fake votes that she was bringing in unsecured, unofficial vehicles. I remember very distinctly a video of ballots being loaded into the back of a Porsche. And, because Broward is a blue county, the people who were really making a stink over this were the supporters of Debbie Wasserman Schultz's primary challengers. So these were people, on the left who were challenging the supervisor of elections for, on grounds of voter fraud. And this sort of thing we know happens from time to time. It's just that most of the time people are relatively assured that it doesn't happen in big enough numbers to make a difference to completely delegitimize the results of an election. An election has to be really close for these kinds of machinations to make a difference. And of course, on election night in Florida, it appeared as though Ron DeSantis was the winner. And he, of course, did later on become the governor. But in the following days after election night, we were getting in a lot of mail-in ballots that were being counted, and it was swinging things closer and closer towards Andrew Gillum. So much so that after all was said and done, we had to have a recount here in Florida. Another Florida recount. It wasn't, as big of news as it was in 2000, but it was still a big deal at the time. I was actually an observer of that recount. There were a lot of people who went and watched it because, it was exciting. It was like 2000 all over again. There were seats set up for spectators to watch people feeding ballots through the machines in every county. And something that I remember coming up is that there was a board of people who were sitting at a desk, or not at a desk, at a table, who were there to review ballots that were sort of in a gray area of whether or not they should be counted or not, that weren't necessarily filled out correctly, or that couldn't be picked up by the machine. Essentially, if a ballot wasn't properly scanned through the machine, it wasn't read right into the system, that ballot would be spit back out. They'd take it into the room and they'd say, okay, can we see what this person was trying to achieve? So, for example, these ballots here in Florida are scantrons, like you would use on a standardized test in a public school setting. And so you have to fill in the bubble completely with a pencil for your vote to be counted. And you would have certain cases where people would draw an X, or they would circle the option, or they would do a check mark instead of filling in the bubble. And in those cases, here at least, the I can't remember the name of the whatever the group of people who were reviewing these ballots, they would go out and fill out a new ballot for this person, to try and help them so that their vote would be counted even though they filled it out incorrectly. But I know that in other jurisdictions, they're not so generous with people. And when someone doesn't fill out their ballot correctly, their ballot gets thrown out. There are a lot of ballots that end up getting thrown out every election cycle just because they're not filled out properly. And when you have mail-in ballots, the rate of attrition when it comes to ballots not being filled out correctly and being thrown out is a lot higher than when people vote in person. So, in effect, when we have this very high rate of mail-in ballots, another thing that we have to worry about delegitimizing the results of the election is that a lot of ballots are going to be thrown out. A lot more ballots than otherwise would have been, under normal circumstances. So whoever loses under this case, under this scenario, is going to look at all those ballots that were thrown out, however many millions there are, and say, look at all these millions of people whose votes weren't counted. Was it that they were throwing out all the votes that were for me? Is it that these were the voices of my supporters being suppressed? Why would they throw out so many more ballots than they have in past elections? No matter who wins, whether it's Trump or Biden, they can make that case. And, this is far from the first time that we have had situations in America where, the results of an election were kind of inconclusive. And what ended up happening in the past was that essentially, for the better of the country, somebody would eventually concede and would say that, hey, sure, there might have been some funny business going on or whatever, but let's just try and move on. I'm going to say, you win, I'm going to bow out, and, we're going to go about and live our lives. I think probably the most famous example of this was in 1960 when the state of Illinois was stolen from Richard Nixon through voter fraud in Chicago. Chicago, very corrupt city, especially back then, controlled by Democrats. It was an old, sort of an old-timey white ethnic kind of regime. In Chicago, you don't really have ethnic machine politics as much in cities these days, at least not, white ethnics. That's kind of an outdated concept. But at the time, they were very powerful, and they were able to swing the election for Kennedy. And Nixon knew it on election night that Illinois had been stolen from him. But because Illinois was, by itself was not enough to swing the election in Nixon's favor, he did not contest the results of Illinois for the better of the country. He thought it would be bad to try and delegitimize the election because he knew he'd lost anyway. So he just decided to bow out, not contest anything, say, hey, Jack Kennedy wins, great for him, I'm going to go back and play golf in California. And that was just fine. Now, another famous case, but less notable perhaps, is 1876, in which the eventual president, President Hayes, I can't remember the name of the Democrat candidate, but it was pretty close, and they were fighting over who the real president should be. And essentially, what ended up happening, in order for the Democrat to concede, they made a deal with the Republicans. The Republicans essentially made some concessions to the Democrats, and the Democrats then let Hayes become the next president. And that concession, of course, was the end of Reconstruction. And so most people, when you hear about that in history class, they just talk about the end of Reconstruction and, oh, it was this compromise between, to let Rutherford B. Hayes become president. But what you don't really hear, they don't focus too much on the election itself, and that was the reason why Reconstruction was ended, was because the Democrats would have pushed harder to make sure that Hayes wasn't the president had he not made that concession. And so the reason why I cite these two examples of the two parties either making concessions to one another to end up, for allowing one side to concede, or for one side just conceding outright for the better of the country to try and make sure that the election is viewed as legitimate. Neither of these scenarios are possible in 2020. Both sides have made that clear. In fact, I believe it was Hillary Clinton who said that she does not believe that Joe Biden should concede the election under any circumstances. Now, Hillary never technically conceded either, but it was pretty clear afterwards. She gave a sour grapes speech the next day, and that was kind of her concession, even though she never said the words. Now, on the other hand, Donald Trump, I don't think would be I don't think that he would do, sort of the most, he wouldn't have the same cartoonish reaction that many in the mainstream media are forecasting, that when Trump loses, oh my gosh, he'll refuse to leave office and the military will have to remove him. I don't think Trump would ever go that far. But I do think that what's likely is that if Trump loses, he will leave, but he will he will badmouth the process on the way out. He'll essentially say that it wasn't fair, and he will make good points, I think. I think that, both he and Biden, no matter which one of them lose, have a very good case to make that the game was rigged against them. That doesn't necessarily mean that I believe both of them, but I do think that they can both make that case, no matter which one of them loses. And so after the election, when the next guy is president, they can go back and say to their supporters, you know what, we fought the good fight and we deserved to win and we should have won. And the only reason why we didn't win is because we were cheated out of it. And the ultimate result of that is that whoever is elected president, whoever ends up being the next president, is only going to be really legitimate in the eyes of their own supporters. And that's a big shift in America. That's something that we haven't had in this country since 1860. Now, you could say that we have that now, that people on the left never really accepted that Trump is president, and I would agree with that. But I still don't think that we are quite to the point to where I think that there's still an instinctive understanding in the American public that whoever wins an election is the president. And yes, we had people who had there were lots of people with, bumper stickers during the Bush years that had a picture of George W. Bush that said, "Not my president." But that's more of an expression of contempt rather than an expression of, hey, this person is, literally stole an election and shouldn't be in office. In countries where people do not recognize, where the opposition does not recognize the victor of an election, you end up with situations like in Venezuela, where the Congress or the Parliament, I can't remember which they call it in Venezuela, because it kind of varies in Latin American countries. Some of them use European conventions, and some of them use American conventions in their naming of their institutions. But let's just call them the Parliament in Venezuela. They do not recognize Maduro as the president of Venezuela. They say that their boy Guaido is the president of Venezuela. And so, the parliament in Venezuela does not work with Maduro. Maduro has, works by himself. And so their institutions, have broken down. Their government is no longer operating normally. And the same thing may be true, here in the very near future. Because at the end of the day, even though right now people think that things are heated, in Washington it's not really quite like that. No matter how much they cry and they try to impeach Trump, at the end of the day, they still sign off on what's viewed as the important things that everyone agrees on, like, say, funding the military in all of the wars in the Middle East. You notice that stuff still gets funded somehow. Because as of right now, the Democrats still are, they're using, by saying that, Trump was installed by Russia and that he's Putin's puppet, they don't really believe that. They're just using that sort of as a political tool that's rhetorical on their part. They're using this to get elected. They use these, and this is very dangerous language because that is directly leading us towards the next stage of people literally not recognizing the winner of the next election. It is sort of buttering people up for that. But for right now, the Democrats are channeling that energy of saying that, Trump is not, he's not the legitimate president. They're channeling that into fundraising. They're channeling that into, get out the vote efforts. They're telling people, hey, if you think that Putin shouldn't win the next election, well, then, you better vote harder, as absurd as that sounds. But for now, people are buying into it. They think that, okay, Trump is an aberration. This happened once. It shouldn't have happened, but it'll never happen again as long as we vote harder. The problem was in 2016, there were sexists who didn't want to vote for Hillary. And so somehow this terrible guy Trump got through because we didn't think he could win, and then it ended up happening. All because of Putin, but still there were other factors. We could have beaten Putin if we tried harder. I think that's I think that's kind of the attitude right now. But if they lose again going up against Trump, then it will be confirmed in their eyes 100% that, oh my gosh, we can't win. Our democracy is dead. And Trump won twice because it was unfathomable to them that Trump won the first time. But hey, there's always flukes. There's always these anomalies in statistical averages. You always end up with outliers. But lightning never strikes twice. Am I right? So if magically lightning does strike twice and Trump is reelected, it's going to be very, very hard to convince a lot of these people that that's justified. And if people view the government as illegitimate, as unelected, then the government has no power. The states don't really have any power over you per se. There's only so many people who actually work for the government, and if everyone just said we don't want to obey anymore, the government would have no power. But the reason why the government does have power is because, the vast majority of people say, you know what, I accept this government, you're legitimate, I might not always agree with you, but your authority is real. But if you get to the point to where only the people who are voting for Trump actually think that, or Joe Biden, and I'll get to the situation with Trump supporters and how they will react to a Biden victory. If you get to the point to where Trump is the president and only his supporters think that he is actually the president, you're going to end up with a breakdown in the, well, I hate to say law and order because that's such a cliche, but people will not respect the state. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing at all. I don't respect the state either, but for different reasons, of course. Once you go down this road, however, I don't think that there's any coming back, because if you get to the point to where the Democrats only accept the legitimacy of the government when the Democrats are in power, well then, on the other hand, when the Democrats are in power, the Republicans probably will not recognize the legitimacy of the Democrats. And this is a highly unsustainable situation. It is a situation which must decay. There's no way around it. It can only get worse, until it gets better. You can't maintain a situation where the government is only recognized by half of the population. And so now let's discuss what scenarios, what it would look like if Joe Biden won, which is quite possible. From the polling I've seen. Now, of course, I thought that Hillary was going to win in 2016 based on the polling, but there was a lot of the states that ended up swinging things in Trump's favor were underpolled. Hillary wasn't campaigning them. She wasn't trying to win them. That's different this time around. Joe Biden is trying to win the Rust Belt states. He's campaigning by Joe Biden standards, he's campaigning hard to win those states, and those states are being polled regularly. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, these 4 states are being polled, and Joe Biden is trying to win them. And, based on that alone, I think that gives him a very good chance. And he's from the polls we're seeing, which are coming out regularly, he's doing pretty well. So what if Joe Biden wins after all the mail-in ballots are counted in the in the weeks after the election? I guess first let's talk about sort of the worst situation, which is what people are calling the red mirage. The red mirage basically means that on election night, Trump does quite well with in-person voting, but then over the next few weeks, all of the massive amount of mail-in ballots start getting counted, and it swings things all the way back the other end in favor of Joe Biden. So on election night, if you're watching on TV, it looks like, oh, Trump's in the lead here, everywhere, and he's doing really well, and he's on the road to win 307 electoral votes, let's say, right around what he won last time. And then all of a sudden, the mail-in ballots start getting counted, and all these states, like let's say Minnesota, where Trump might be leading on election night, or Wisconsin, where Trump might be leading on election night, or Pennsylvania, where Trump might be leading on election night, all of these states start swinging back the other direction in favor of Biden, and Biden, ekes out a victory in a whole bunch of states that Trump looked to be leading pretty well on election night. And then what do you end up with? You end up with a situation where Joe Biden comes away with a huge electoral victory, let's say 350 electoral votes, well above the 270 necessary for winning. And Trump supporters who watched coverage on election night, who went out and voted on election day and saw all of the other Trump supporters out in force voting on election day, they look at the TV and see, oh, Biden wins, he has 350 electoral votes. They're going to shake their heads and just say that is not consistent with what I saw, with what with my own eyes on election day. This was stolen from Trump. And Trump, I don't think, will be able to resist indulging himself, because he's already said this, so he can't back out on it now, that if all of a sudden on election night he's winning, and then weeks later after a bunch of mail-in ballots come in, and they all swing in favor of Biden, I think that Trump, as he said in the past, as Republicans have said for a long time, because this is the legitimate point, that these, there is a suspicion that there could be ballot stuffing going on. Trump and a lot of his supporters and a lot of Republicans are going to feel that this result is illegitimate. And so what does that mean? Does that mean rioting in the streets? No, I don't think it does. I don't think that is a part of the sort of the right-wing character in America. I don't think right-wingers are prone to do that sort of thing. It's not how people express themselves. It's also why right-wingers don't protest peacefully or otherwise. And I didn't even discuss that in the Biden scenario, but I do very much think that the riots will intensify if Biden loses. Not because all of the Antifa folks are just holding out their hopes that Biden will win, but that the ranks of those people will be swelled by people who voted hard in 2020 and lost and said, you know what, F this system, we need something new. We have to change things because the direction we're going on is not getting us anywhere. I don't think that you'll have that same phenomenon on the right. I don't think that you will see people out in the streets if Trump loses. You're not going to see MAGA riots. But what you will see is a great apathy in America. People in this country who support the president will not riot if Joe Biden becomes president in this manner that I've talked about with the red mirage or whatever, but they will never accept it in their heart. And even though later on, let's say after, in another 4 years, a Republican ends up getting elected or something like that, assuming nothing else happens in that time, which is a big assumption. I don't think that we will go another 4 years without major events, major destabilizing events. But let's say we do, and another Republican becomes president. I don't think that these people will ever go back to having faith in the electoral system. They will essentially have taken a red pill on democracy and realize that democracy is a sham. Now, I don't think necessarily that democracy is a sham because either the election was stolen from Biden or Trump. It's not. I believe it's a sham in other ways, that you have a false choice most of the time when it comes to elections, that you don't have real choices. But that's, they're still going to be in that category of losing faith in the electoral process, in our system of government, which, of course, as I said in the case with the Democrats, is an unsustainable state. That cannot go on forever, and it will not go on forever. What will end up happening is there will be some trigger, some moment where people in this country, on one side or the other, will be asked to put their trust, to put their faith in their government, and they will say no. Another situation like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, perhaps, or a situation in which there's some big new law passed that affects something very core to people's hearts, like say big gun control law. A time when it actually becomes difficult for people to just sit idly by and remain apathetic about government, and at that moment you will see a groundswell in this country of people who do not want to comply anymore, who simply will withdraw their consent. Another good example will be the inevitable financial collapse of the U.S. federal government, the bankruptcy of the U.S. federal government. Everyone knows that the debt can't be paid, and as soon as interest rates go up, things are, it's over. There will have to be a restructuring of the debt, and it will be very painful. Very similar to what happened to, say, the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia or other countries. At the end of the Cold War, they had a financial reckoning, and their old systems collapsed. And those systems didn't collapse just because they went bankrupt. It's because they went bankrupt, things got broken, and people said, you know what, let's not rebuild things the exact same way. There was no consensus to put things back together and to restore the old order. No one wanted to do that at the end because they'd grown tired of it. It had lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the people who lived there. And so that's the road that we're marching down in this country, and this election will be a very important step in that direction, no matter who wins. The era of legitimate U.S. presidents that are accepted by the American people as the President of the United States is over. So, with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.